I knew something was wrong the second the eggnog hit the wall. It burst in a pale explosion against my parents' cream-colored dining room paint, dripping in slow, sticky trails that looked almost like melting snow. Lila stood at the head of the table, chest heaving, her phone clenched in one hand, the other still raised from the throw. Her eyes, wide, glassy, furious, locked onto mine like I was a stranger who had broken into her home. My father froze with his wine glass halfway to his mouth until it slipped from his fingers and shattered at his feet. My mother pressed a hand to her chest as if trying to hold herself upright, breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a sob. The Christmas lights blinked softly above us, painfully cheerful in the middle of the silence. And I just sat there, 30 years old and suddenly 6 years old again, feeling every Christmas I had ever been overlooked collapse into this one impossible moment. 30 years earlier, Christmas had been far simpler, at least for everyone else. For me, it was the season I learned exactly who I was in our family, the background character to Lila's leading role. I still remember being 6 and watching her unwrap a mountain of presents, each box bigger than the last, each bow chosen to match her golden hair. She was 9 that year, the shining star, as my mother liked to say. I sat cross-legged in my pajamas, holding a small package of wool socks on my lap, while my parents clapped for Lila's new dollhouse, her new velvet coat, her new dance shoes. "You're practical, sweetheart," my mother said when she noticed my eyes drifting to Lila's pile. "Practical gifts are better for you." It became our family script. Practical for me, magical for her. Year after year. By the time I turned 10, the pattern was unmistakable. My stocking always hung slightly behind Lila's, on the mantel half the size and never quite full. My gifts were things I needed: pencils, notebooks, a scratchy sweater, while Lila received things she deserved. Jewelry kits, glittery boots, a camera she used for exactly 3 days before losing interest. One Christmas when I was 11, I found the ornament I had made in art class, hidden behind a row of glittering ones with Lila's name on them. Mine was smudged clay with a crooked star. Lila's were glass and gold and placed right where the lights hit. I asked my mother why mine wasn't on the front of the tree. She smiled politely. "Oh, honey, we just want the tree to look put together." That was the day I learned even Christmas decorations had a hierarchy. In our house, Lila was the bright one, beautiful, social, talented at anything with a spotlight. And me, I was the quiet one, the reliable one, the one teachers praised but no one really saw. And because I was quiet, everyone assumed I was fine, that I didn't need cheering up or celebrating or attention. The truth was that no one asked whether I needed those things. They just decided I didn't. By the time high school rolled around, the favoritism had calcified into something so natural that no one even noticed it anymore. When Lila didn't get the lead in the winter showcase, my parents drove her to Chicago to lift her spirits. When I won the regional math award that same month, I came home to a note on the kitchen counter: "Dinner in the fridge. Proud of you." That December, during the family Christmas party, I overheard my mother talking to a neighbor while I was refilling the cider. "We worry a lot about Lila," she sighed. "She has so much potential. Hannah's different. She's steady. She doesn't need us the way Lila does." Steady. That was their word for me. Steady, quiet, low maintenance. Steady as in invisible. I poured myself a cup of cider just to give my hands something to do. In a way, I learned to live around the missing pieces. I learned that applause always belonged to someone else, that the camera pointed toward Lila while I stood behind it. That Christmas morning was her stage and I was the audience. But I also learned something they never meant to teach me. I learned how to listen, how to observe, how to build a world where I didn't need applause to exist. I learned that if I wanted anything, security, success, freedom, I would have to create it myself. Maybe that's why, instead of crying in my room or fighting back for attention, I knew I'd never get. I buried myself in books. Finance textbooks, business case studies, anything that felt like a door out of the life where I was only ever the afterthought. My teachers loved me. My parents barely noticed. It only made me work harder. Every Christmas reinforced the lesson. Lila danced in recitals, posed with her new designer boots, and collected cheers. I stood in the kitchen slicing apples for pie because you're so good at helping honey. When I turned 16, I applied for my first part-time job without telling anyone. Babysitting, then cashier shifts, then tutoring. If I wanted something, even something small, I bought it myself. My parents never stopped funding Lila's hobbies long enough to notice that I'd started supporting myself. And each year the distance grew. Lila's gifts got bigger, mine got more practical. Their praise for Lila grew louder, their praise for me got quieter. By the time I graduated high school, my stocking might as well have been empty. So no, the eggnog splattering the dining room wall didn't just shock me. It felt like the ghost of every childhood Christmas rising all at once. Because while Lila's meltdown tonight was about the article on her phone, the truth is her explosion began decades before, and deep down, I think mine did too. I spent most of my childhood learning to live in the quiet spaces other people left behind. While Lila grew louder with age, her laughter, her crises, her spotlight, my world grew smaller and more private. Not because I wanted it that way, but because there was no room for me anywhere else. The strange thing is, neglect doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like being treated as though you're already grown long before you actually are. By the time I was 7, my parents trusted me to do things they never would have asked of Lila at that age: clean up the kitchen without being told, watch myself after school, help carry in groceries, soothe my own disappointments, swallow hurt without complaint. Meanwhile, Lila was still being tucked into bed at 10. Most people assume the difficult child gets the short end of the stick, but in our house it was the opposite. Lila's tears could halt an entire weekend. Her joy determined the mood of the whole family. If she wanted peace and quiet, we tiptoed. If she wanted attention, everything else stopped. If she wanted something, it was magically provided. Whether she kept it, broke it, or abandoned it, didn't matter. My parents' love wasn't unkind, but it was unbalanced. Lila was fragile. I was fine. I remember one year in elementary school when I was determined to win the holiday reading competition. I checked out armfuls of books, stayed up under the blanket with a flashlight, and even read during commercials while the family watched TV. On the last day of school before winter break, my teacher announced I'd read more pages than the entire class combined. My mother picked me up that day. I slid into the passenger seat, waiting for her to notice the certificate in my hand. She glanced once, smiled distractedly, and said, "That's nice, sweetheart, but we need to hurry. Lila has a costume fitting in 20 minutes. That certificate stayed folded in my coat pocket until spring." My elementary school memories are full of moments like that. I didn't realize at the time how much they shaped me. I only knew the world seemed to pay attention to one of us, and it wasn't me. When I hit middle school, I leaned deeper into the one place where attention didn't matter: numbers. Numbers didn't ask for applause. They didn't need a performance. They didn't get jealous. They just told the truth. I loved the certainty of addition, the predictability of patterns, the calm logic that reminded me life could make sense even when people didn't. By 13, I was tutoring kids older than me. By 14, I was saving more money than my parents realized. "You're so responsible," Mom would say, marveling at how I never asked for anything. But I didn't ask because asking felt pointless. Lila asked. Lila received. That was the way of our house, as fixed as the North Star. The older I got, the more invisible I became. Freshman year of high school, I got into the accelerated math track. When I told my parents, Dad nodded absently and asked if Lila needed help printing flyers for her dance showcase. Sophomore year, I won a statewide business essay contest. The trophy went on my dresser. No one mentioned it. Junior year, I landed a part-time job at a local cafe and saved every dollar I earned. Senior year, I interned at a small accounting office downtown, something I was incredibly proud of. But when college acceptance letters came, it became clear just how little they had followed my life. "Wow," Mom said when she saw the envelope from Madison Tech. "Are you sure they didn't send this by mistake?" I laughed, but it stung. They were shocked to learn I'd been in the top 5% of my class. Shocked to learn professors recommended me by name. Shocked to learn I'd been piling awards into the back of my closet for years. But that night at dinner, all conversation still revolved around Lila's excitement for her new audition, her new boyfriend, her new something. Everything was new with Lila. Everything with me had been steady, unremarkable, easy to miss. I didn't resent her. I resented the way I had disappeared in her shadow. Even then, part of me hoped college would change something. Maybe distance would give my parents a clearer view of who I was. Maybe they'd notice the life I was building brick by brick. Maybe they'd ask about my classes or my professors or whether I still liked finance. Instead, I learned that absence didn't make the heart grow fonder. It just made the neglect quieter. During my first fall at Madison Tech, I called home every Sunday. The conversations always went the same. How's Lila's job hunt going? What happened with Lila's audition? Did Lila ever get over that boy who ghosted her? Eventually, Mom would ask, "And you, sweetheart? Everything going fine?" "Yes, Mom, good. You've always been so independent." The truth sat like a stone in my throat. I wasn't independent because I wanted to be. I was independent because I had to be. I lived on scholarships, part-time campus work, and the money I'd saved from high school jobs. I stocked my fridge with whatever was cheapest. I studied in the library until closing. I bought my textbooks secondhand and learned early to fix my own laptop. I didn't party, didn't waste $1, didn't take anything for granted. But the strangest thing happened during those years. I started to flourish. One afternoon during my sophomore year, my econ professor pulled me aside after class. "You have a mind for this," he said, eyes sharp behind thin glasses. "Not just finance systems thinking, you see patterns others miss." I didn't know how to respond. No one had ever spoken to me like that. He encouraged me to attend guest lectures, gave me articles to read, loaned me books from his personal collection. He was the first adult who treated me like someone with real potential, not the steady child who didn't need anything. I absorbed every bit of it. Meanwhile, Lila kept burning through part-time jobs and boyfriends with equal speed. She'd call me crying about someone ghosting her, or Mom scolding her, or Dad asking her to be more responsible. I listened always. I soothed her always. I cheered her on always. At home, Mom and Dad were still sending her money for emergencies. And every time Lila spiraled, Mom would say, "Thank God we never had to worry about you, Hannah." She meant it as a compliment. It felt like another way to say, you don't get to be the one in trouble. You don't get to need help. You don't get to take up space. So I built space for myself instead. I started tinkering with spreadsheets and tools to help small businesses track cash flow. It began as something I made for myself, then for my tutoring clients, then for a friend who ran a tiny bakery. I didn't know it then, but those quiet evenings in my dorm laptop open textbooks stacked beside me, a mug of instant coffee going cold were the first bricks of Northflow Analytics. The first thing I ever built that was entirely mine. Most nights during those years, I'd sit by the window of my dorm and watch snow fall across campus. Students rushed to parties, couples walked hand in hand, friends laughed their way to the dining hall. I didn't have any of that, not then. But I had something else, a hunger, a focus, a belief that somewhere someday I'd get to live a life where I wasn't the afterthought. And maybe that belief was the faintest spark of revenge. Revenge not against my family, but against the small life they assumed I was destined for. What they saw as steady, I knew was resilience. What they saw as low maintenance, I knew was survival. What they thought was invisibility was actually preparation. I was building something they couldn't see, something that would one day force them to look at me, really look at me for the first time in their lives. But that day was still far away. For now, I was just the quiet daughter calling home every Sunday, listening to the updates about Lila's life, while mine grew silently, steadily into something they'd never imagined. And I had no idea how explosive it would be when they finally found out. By the time I turned 22, the gap between the life my parents thought I lived and the life I was actually building had widened into something almost comical. They still pictured me as the steady daughter who worked part-time, studied quietly, and would one day settle into a modest, predictable job. In reality, I was juggling classes, 2 campus jobs, a tutoring side hustle, and the earliest version of what would become North Flow, though I didn't even have a name for it back then. It was just a messy, scrappy spreadsheet-turned tool I kept refining because numbers made more sense to me than people ever had. The first person who noticed was Gene, the owner of the tiny cafe where I worked weekend mornings. He was in his 50s, soft-spoken, exhausted in the way small business owners always were. One slow Sunday, he was hunched over his ledger, groaning under his breath. "You good?" I asked, wiping down a counter. He sighed. "I swear this place bleeds money. I just never know when or why. It's like cash flow roulette." Without thinking, I pulled up my laptop. "Can I show you something?" He blinked at me. "You know accounting?" "Not really," I said, "but I know patterns." I typed in his last 12 months of numbers. The little model I'd built flagged trends he hadn't seen: wasteful supply orders, mismatched vendor billing, peak hours that weren't being staffed correctly. Gene stared at the screen like I'd turned water into wine. "How'd you do that, trial and error?" He laughed. "Kid, this is smarter than half the software I've paid for." He insisted on paying me for the tool. I refused. He paid me anyway, slipping a folded check into the tip jar with my name on it. I didn't realize it then, but that was the first time someone saw the value of what I was creating. Not my parents, not Lila, not any teacher or advisor, just a tired cafe owner who needed help and recognized it when he saw it. That moment stayed with me longer than he ever knew. Around the same time my junior year, I got my first internship at a local financial firm. It wasn't glamorous. I did grunt work, data cleaning, formatting reports, converting files, anything tedious no one else wanted. But I listened. I absorbed. I watched analysts and senior managers break down complex financial issues that felt to me like the real language of the world. One afternoon, during a particularly chaotic week near quarter end, an analyst named Peter was swearing under his breath at a spreadsheet that refused to balance. "I can try," I offered quietly. He groaned. "It's a mess, Hannah. Don't torture yourself." But I opened the file anyway. 30 minutes later, I found the error, an extra decimal in a nested formula. When I fixed it, the whole thing snapped into place like a puzzle that finally made sense. Peter stared at me. "You're scary," he said. In like a gifted child who went undiagnosed way. I laughed harder than I meant to. He had no idea how accurate that was. The internship didn't pay much, but it paid something more important: confidence. And that confidence seeped into everything I touched, including North Flow. The more clients I helped, small shops, tutoring parents, a friend's family-owned hardware store, the more I refined the tool. At first, it was just a spreadsheet, then a macro-heavy file, then something closer to a lightweight app I cobbled together through online tutorials and trial and error coding at 2 a.m. By the end of senior year, I had unofficial clients. They paid me small amounts, but every transaction felt like proof that I wasn't imagining my abilities. That maybe, just maybe, I wasn't destined to remain invisible forever. My parents, of course, had no idea. The few times I came home during breaks, the conversations were always the same. "Hannah, could you talk to Lila? She's overwhelmed with her retail job. Hannah, maybe you can help your sister rework her resume. Hannah, can you give Lila advice on budgeting? She says she's drowning again." They never asked what I was doing. Never asked how classes were going. Never asked about the nights I spent building out my tool, or the part-time jobs I worked, or the internships I chased, or the quiet fire in me that kept growing. Lila would plop onto the couch during these visits, scrolling through her phone like the world revolved around her. And in my parents' eyes, it still did. One evening during Christmas break of my senior year, she flopped down beside me and said, "It must be nice not to have pressure." "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "You're not the one they expect to shine. You're the steady one, the one who doesn't mess up. I'm the one who has to live up to their hopes." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Lila truly believed she was the pressured child, and I, who had been ignored my entire life, had lived weight-free. The irony almost crushed me. "They don't pressure me," I said slowly. "They just assume I don't need anything." She snorted. "Same thing." It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, and even then she didn't hear me. After that winter break, I returned to campus with a sharper edge. I poured everything I felt, every overlooked moment, every swallowed hurt, into graduating early. I overloaded my schedule, took summer courses, and lived like someone chasing oxygen. I slept 4 hours a night. I ate whatever was cheap. I breathed code case studies spreadsheets. While other students partied on weekends, I met with small clients in back rooms of cafes or over Zoom calls squeezed between my shifts. My tool became smarter, faster, more intuitive, and the list of people who relied on it kept growing. One night during spring semester, I sat alone in the campus library with my laptop open, the room quiet, except for the hum of the heating vents. Snow piled against the windows in soft curves. Outside, students laughed on their way to late-night pizza. I wasn't lonely. I was building something. I didn't know what yet, but I knew it mattered. That night, I whispered something to myself I'd never said out loud. You don't need to be seen to become someone. It stuck with me. Right after graduation, I moved into a tiny studio apartment with a view of a brick wall and the sound of delivery trucks at all hours. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I set up a folding table as a desk, lined up my thrifted monitors, and dedicated the first wall space to sticky notes full of features I wanted to add to the tool. Some nights I'd eat canned soup while debugging code. Other nights I'd run profit simulations for bakery owners at midnight because my accountant friend said, "You're good." This was the year Northflow stopped being a hobby and started becoming a business, even if I didn't call it that yet. Meanwhile, Lila drifted through her early 20s like a kite with a severed string. She worked retail jobs she hated, quit them impulsively. Dated boyfriends who lasted 3 weeks, moved back home twice, and called mom crying at least twice a month. And my parents kept rescuing her, paying off her credit cards, covering her rent after yet another impulsive apartment swap, funding her attempts at finding herself. Their voices always carried the same tremor. "We're so worried about Lila. She needs us." Never once did they wonder whether I needed anything. Not love, not attention, not support, and certainly not their worry. But here's the thing. Silence becomes a habit. And once you learn to live without being seen, it's easy to keep secrets. Easy to build a world where the people who overlooked you can't follow. Easy to disappear into your work until your life grows so far beyond their imagination that it becomes unrecognizable. By the time I turned 24, I'd outgrown the folding table, tripled my client list, and had a functioning prototype of the analytics tool that would eventually rewrite everything. I was still invisible to my family. But that invisibility had become something else. A shield. A refuge. A quiet power. And without meaning to, I had built an entire life behind it. A life that was about to outgrow the shadows and force my family to see me whether they wanted to or not. The email came in at 6:42 on a Tuesday morning, right as I was pouring cheap coffee into a chipped mug in my tiny apartment. I almost ignored it. Most messages at that hour were junk or automated notifications from the freelancing platforms I occasionally used. But the subject line stopped me mid-sip. Inquiry Cash Flow Model Demonstration. I stared at it, heart thudding. Nobody used the word inquiry unless they meant business. Real business. I clicked. Ms. Ellison. We were referred to you through Gene Patterson. We've heard about the financial forecasting model you've built and would like to invite you to demonstrate it for our development team. Mark Renner, VP of Technology, Lakeview Regional Bank. I read it again. And again. And then a third time because my brain refused to accept that an actual bank wanted to see something I built alone at 2 a.m. in a cramped studio apartment with mismatched furniture and a heating vent that rattled in the winter wind. Gene. Of course. He must have mentioned the tool to someone without telling me. I didn't even know he had connections to anyone outside his coffee shop. But apparently, the world was smaller and stranger than I ever realized. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to electricity run through me. I showed up to the bank 2 days later wearing the only blazer I owned, purchased from a thrift shop, and tailored in the shoulders with YouTube tutorials and a sewing kit. My laptop was old, the fan whining too loudly when under pressure, and my hands were shaking so hard when I walked through the glass doors that I had to tuck them into my pockets. The building smelled like polished wood, and money quiet, orderly, serious. I felt like an imposter walking through it. Mark Renner met me in the lobby. He was in his early 50s, graying hair, sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He shook my hand and led me to a conference room where 4 other people were already seated, staring at me with curiosity. "So," Mark said, gesturing to the screen, "show us what you've built." My voice came out steadier than I felt. I plugged in my laptop, opened the interface, and let the room fall into silence as my financial model loaded color-coded charts, predictive refill cycles, revenue projections, and a dashboard I'd designed to be intuitive even for people who hated numbers. I walked them through everything: how it tracked trends, how it predicted cash shortages before they hit, how it spotted unusual spending patterns, and how it could help their small business clients make smarter decisions. 10 minutes in the room shifted. Everyone leaned forward. Someone muttered, "This is clean. Very clean." Another asked, "What's your background in development?" I answered honestly. "Trial and error." Mark raised a brow. "Self-taught?" "Yes." He exchanged a look with the man beside him. A good look. When I finished, they asked me to wait outside so they could discuss. I stood in the hallway with sweaty palms, staring at a framed photo of the original bank founders, all stoic and serious. After what felt like an hour, though the clock said 6 minutes, Mark opened the door. "Come in," he said. "We'd like to make you an offer." I sat down, bracing for disappointment. Maybe they wanted to hire me part-time. Maybe they wanted me to volunteer my model for free. Maybe they wanted advice. What they offered was none of those things. "We'd like to license your model for 12 of our branches on a trial basis," Mark said, sliding a folder toward me. "And if the trial goes well, we'll extend to the entire region." I opened the folder. I counted the zeros twice. Then a third time. It wasn't life-changing money. Not yet. But for the first time in my life, I felt the ground shift under my feet. A door was opening. A bigger one than I'd ever dared to imagine. I walked out of that building in a daze, the winter air burning my lungs with each inhale. I wanted to call someone, share it, celebrate. But I had no one who would understand. Certainly not my parents. Instead, I walked to Gene's cafe. He was wiping down tables, humming to himself, when I burst in with a breathless grin. "They licensed it," I said. "The bank. They want it." Gene blinked. Then he grinned so wide I thought his face might split. "I knew it," he said, pulling me into a hug. "You're going places, kid." He was the first person other than myself who truly believed that. The next morning I sent him my notice. He hugged me again, wished me well, and told me to visit whenever I wanted free coffee. I cried a little walking out the door. I spent the next week registering Northflow Analytics as a business, buying a desk off Facebook Marketplace and renting my first tiny office downtown, barely more than 2 rooms and a hallway. But to me it felt like a skyscraper. I scrubbed the floors myself, set up my monitors, and put my name on the tiny frosted glass door. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was stepping into a version of myself. My family had spent years pretending didn't exist. They never knew I'd opened a business, never asked what I was doing after graduation, never wondered why I had to buy my own laptop, my own software, my own everything. Instead, the next time my mother called, she spoke for 20 minutes about Lila's new idea for a handmade accessory boutique and how they were thinking about giving her money to get started. "What about you?" she asked at the end, almost as an afterthought. "I'm busy," I said. "That's good," she replied cheerfully. Busy is good for you. You don't need much. It was the same line she'd been using my whole life. I hung up and stared at the empty office around me, the soft hum of the radiator filling the silence. I didn't know it then, but that sentence, "You don't need much," would become the reason I hid my success for years. If they believed I didn't need anything, then they'd believe my money wasn't mine. They'd think it was meant to be shared, smoothed, redistributed, used to lift Lila whenever she fell. And she fell often. When Christmas came that year, I drove home from the city wearing an inexpensive sweater and jeans, so my family wouldn't make comments about getting too fancy. Lila had recently quit another job. Mom and Dad were funding her new boutique dream. At dinner, she was beaming, talking about color palettes and ribbon choices. "Dad's helping me with the initial investment," she said sweetly. Dad nodded proudly. "We'll figure something out, princess." I sat beside them in silence, eating mashed potatoes I didn't taste. When Mom asked about my work, I said, "It's going well." She nodded vaguely, then leaned forward to ask Lila another question about her boutique signage. I don't know when I stopped expecting them to care. Maybe sometime in middle school, maybe earlier. It didn't matter. What mattered was that their disinterest had become a kind of freedom. They didn't care what I was doing, so they couldn't interfere. And that meant I could build something bigger than any of us realized. Back in my apartment that night, I poured a single glass of champagne, the cheapest bottle on the grocery shelf, to celebrate signing the deal with the bank. Then I opened my savings spreadsheet and stared at the new total. It wasn't 8 million, not yet. But it was a beginning, and I had built it quietly, carefully, without applause, without support, without anyone noticing. If they wouldn't see me fine, the world would. The year after the first licensing deal felt like stepping onto a moving walkway that kept speeding up every month. One moment, Northflow was a side project I managed between tutoring sessions and late-night code, and the next, it had become something that demanded my whole life, my mind, my time, my attention. It grew quietly but fast, the way ivy climbs a wall when no one's watching. By spring, the bank expanded their contract from 12 branches to the entire region. Small businesses started emailing me directly: hair salons, bakeries, HVAC companies, a small logistics firm in Oak Ridge. I hired my first assistant, then a part-time developer. The office felt too small, too bright, too full. I added another desk, then another. My days blurred into a cycle of meetings, coding client calls, and spreadsheets. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't surviving, I was building. Meanwhile, the version of me my parents believed in never changed. In their heads, I was still the steady one living a simple, modest life. I didn't correct them. Staying invisible had become a habit, a shield I wore so naturally I sometimes forgot it was armor. Their blind spot gave me freedom. It also created distance I tried not to think about. The sharp contrast between my life and theirs became particularly obvious the summer after Northflow expanded. Lila called crying again because she'd lost her part-time retail job. Again. Mom and Dad rushed to help her. Again. "It wasn't her fault," Mom said on the phone, breathless. "She's too creative for those rigid environments." "What happened?" I asked. "The manager said she wasn't showing up on time," Mom said. "But you know how sensitive Lila is. She needs work that appreciates her spirit." "She was supposed to open the store 3 days a week," Dad added quietly. "The owner said they needed reliability." I bit my tongue. Reliability had been my entire identity growing up, but no one had ever called it a valuable trait, at least not when it came from me. That weekend I visited home. The house looked the same as always, the same floral curtains from 2004, the same family photos on the wall featuring Lila in every central position, and the same air of anxious attention circling around her. "Lila's thinking of opening a boutique again," Mom said, plating lasagna. "Something with handmade accessories. She has wonderful taste," Dad added. Lila sprawled across the couch, barely looked up from her phone. "I just need the capital," she said with a casual flip of her hair. "I have the vision." "How much capital?" I asked. She shrugged. "Not that much. Maybe 5,000, maybe 10. It's flexible." Mom hummed approvingly. "We're supporting her however we can." Dad looked tired, but nodded. They didn't ask anything about North Flow. They didn't ask if I needed something. They didn't even remember that I had already opened an office and hired employees. Instead, Mom tapped my arm and said, "Maybe you could help Lila find some part-time work. Something fulfilling. You're good at that organizational stuff." Organizational stuff. That was their phrase for my entire life's work. Lila eventually turned to me and said, "Honestly, Hannah, it must be nice being low pressure. Everyone expects big things from me. You get to just be stable." I swallowed my reply. If I opened my mouth, 30 years of swallowed hurt might come spilling out. Dad patted Lila's knee. "You've always been our dreamer sweetheart." I wanted to scream. Instead, I excused myself to get water. After that visit, I stopped going home as frequently. I stayed in the city, stayed focused, stayed hidden. It was easier to build a future outside a house that kept pushing me back into a past I had outgrown. But while I put distance between myself and my family, North Flow moved even closer to success. I spent long nights polishing features, rewriting modules, adding visual dashboards that small business owners loved. I learned how to pitch, how to negotiate, how to ask for what I used to be afraid to want. One afternoon in late summer, I checked my financial dashboard and froze at the total. $1 million. Not revenue, not valuations, not projections, actual personal net worth. I sat back, stunned. My younger self would have imagined balloons or champagne, or at least a sense of triumph. But what I felt was relief. A release of breath I'd been holding for years. I celebrated alone with a hot chocolate from a street vendor because I didn't know anyone I could tell. Evan didn't even know the full truth yet. And my parents, well, they were busy financing Lila's latest aesthetic studio concept. When I finally visited home again near the holidays, the contrast between my two worlds cracked me open. The house was decorated like always. Garlands, candles, the wreath Lila liked, even though Mom had to remake it every year because Lila insisted it didn't look symmetrical enough. During dinner, Mom nudged me. "What should we get Lila for Christmas? Something to support her business, maybe?" I shrugged. "Whatever you think she needs." Mom smiled as if I'd said something wise. "That's what I love about you, Hannah. You never ask for much. You're so practical." Practical, invisible, steady, still the child who didn't need anything. Lila burst into the dining room holding up a glittery planner. "Look at this," she said proudly. "This is what entrepreneurs use." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Mom cooed. "It's a $15 planner," I murmured. Lila glared at me. Not everyone needs complicated things to feel important. I bit my cheek so hard I tasted iron. When gift-giving time came, Lila tore into a beautifully wrapped package and squealed at the designer tote bag inside. "Thank you. Thank you." She hugged Dad. "This is perfect for my business meetings." She didn't have any, but no one pointed that out. My gift was a set of glassware. "For your apartment," Mom said brightly, "so you can entertain more." I didn't tell her I rarely had guests. I didn't tell her I spent most nights in my office barefoot working until 2 a.m. I didn't tell her that my bank account had quietly crossed 7 figures. I simply said, "Thank you." Later that night, as I packed the glassware into my trunk, I caught Mom whispering to Dad through the kitchen window. "Hannah's so sensible. We never have to worry about her." "And Lila?" Dad asked softly. "We'll support her until she finds her way. That's what parents do." That night, driving back into the city with the lights blurring through my windshield, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't revenge, at least not the sharp kind. It was clarity. I understood maybe for the first time that my family would never see me unless something forced them to. They weren't cruel, they were simply blind. and their blindness had shaped me into someone who'd learned to survive by doing everything alone. I had built North Flow in the shadows. I had become a millionaire in silence. I had created a future they knew nothing about. And now, for the first time, I knew why I had stayed quiet. Because if they didn't know who I really was, they couldn't take it away. They couldn't ask for it. They couldn't guilt me. They couldn't reshape my life to fit their expectations. But a storm was coming, one big enough to drag my secret life straight into the open. And none of us were ready for it. Evan had a way of seeing through me that I both loved and feared. It was subtle, never pushy, never demanding, but I felt it every time he looked at me too long, like he was assessing the weight I carried and wondering why I insisted on holding it alone. The morning he brought up my family was one of those moments. We were sitting on my couch sharing takeout and watching the snow fall outside my apartment window when he said quietly, "You know, it's strange. You talk about your work with so much passion, but the second your parents come up, you shrink." He demonstrated with his shoulders, pulling them inward. I laughed it off. "I don't shrink." He raised an eyebrow. "You disappear." The words landed harder than he probably intended. I wasn't angry, just pierced. "I don't disappear," I said again, softer this time. Evan rested a hand on my knee. "Hannah, if we're thinking about a future together, I need you to let me in. Not just into the parts that are thriving, but into the parts you hide." I swallowed. "I'm not hiding. I'm protecting myself," from what he asked gently. And I couldn't answer because the answer felt too childish, too embarrassing, too old and raw. From being forgotten, from being ignored, from being seen only when convenient. Instead, I whispered, "It's complicated." He didn't push. Evan never pushed. But his silence told me he understood more than I wanted him to. The truth was that I'd been contemplating telling my parents about Northflow for months. Not the details, not the numbers, just the truth of what I'd built. But every time I drafted a message, every time I rehearsed the words, the memories rose like ghosts. Mom's voice. "Hannah doesn't need much." Dad's voice. "Your sister needs our support." Lila's voice. "You're lucky you don't have pressure." None of them had ever been curious enough about me to see what I was capable of. And telling them now, when success had grown so big it was impossible to ignore, felt like handing them a weapon they'd never earned. Still, Evan's words burrowed into me long after he left that night. "You deserve to stop shrinking." A week later, I got an email that would change everything. "Hi, Hannah. This is Amelia from Midwest Business Journal. We're doing a series on emerging tech founders in the region. We heard about Northflow from one of our contacts and would love to feature your story." I blinked at the screen. A feature on me. I assumed it would be a tiny column, a footnote. Maybe a side article buried under local business updates. The idea of being interviewed was terrifying, but also thrilling in a way I didn't expect. I said yes. When Amelia arrived at my office 2 days later, she was younger than I expected, late 20s, sharp eyes, fast handwriting. She didn't ask the surface-level questions I was prepared for. She asked the ones that cut straight through. What inspired Northflow? What was your childhood like? Did anyone encourage you growing up? How did you fund this on your own? I hesitated at the last one. She lowered her pen. Most founders get family help, loans, support. The story is different if you built everything without that. I gave her the truths I was comfortable sharing. I worked multiple jobs, relied on scholarships, learned coding online, built the tool from scratch. I didn't talk about the favoritism, or the loneliness, or the quiet desperation of growing up unnoticed. But something about Amelia's presence made me more honest than I meant to be. At the end of the interview, she asked if she could take photos. I stood in front of my office window trying to look like a real CEO. Evan showed up mid-shoot, he'd brought lunch, and stayed to watch. When Amelia complimented my confidence, Evan smirked at me afterward. "Told you," he whispered. "You shrink for them, but not for the world." He didn't know how painfully accurate that was. A week before Christmas, the article was set to publish. I didn't tell my parents. I told myself it was because the piece would be small, insignificant. That it wouldn't matter. That I didn't owe them explanations for a life they'd never bothered to ask about. But deep down, I knew the truth I didn't tell them because I was afraid. Not afraid of their judgment. Afraid of their sudden interest. Afraid that if they realized what I had built, they'd try to fold me back into the family machine where everything was about Lila. Everything was for Lila. Everything needed to be sacrificed to maintain the fragile balance they'd curated since childhood. And I was tired of being the one who held that balance together. Around that same time, the cracks at home widened. Lila had racked up credit card debt again this time from buying supplies for a studio relaunch she'd abandoned after 3 weeks. My parents were stretched thin emotionally and financially, but they hid it behind forced optimism. Mom called me one evening while I was debugging code. "Honey, your father and I were thinking, maybe you could help Lila find a budgeting method." "I already sent her resources," I said. "She needs more guidance." "She won't listen," I replied. Mom sighed. "She's sensitive. You know that. She needs us." There it was again. She needs us. Not you. Not Hannah. Not our other daughter. Just Lila. I hung up feeling the familiar heaviness in my chest. 2 days later, I brought Evan home for a weekend visit. It was the first time my parents met him. I spent the entire drive rehearsing how to deflect the usual questions, how to keep them from prying into the wrong things, or noticing the gaps between the Hannah they thought they knew and the Hannah I had become. But the moment we stepped inside, something shifted. Mom asked Evan dozens of questions about his job, his family, his hobbies, yet barely spared me a glance. Dad pulled him aside to ask if he thought Lila should try something artistic again. After dinner, as we were leaving, Evan gripped my hand in the driveway. "They don't know you," he said softly. "It's fine," I replied. "No," he insisted. "It's not fine. And it's not normal." I didn't know what to say. I had spent so long convincing myself it was normal. That invisibility was a small price for peace. The night before the article went live, I lay awake watching snow drift across the streetlights outside my window. Evan slept beside me, his hand loosely curled around mine. "They won't care," I whispered into the dark. He squeezed my hand gently, half asleep. "Hannah, this will change everything." The next morning at 7:15, my phone buzzed non-stop. Not with texts from my family. Not with congratulations from people I loved, but with strangers. Bank executives, potential investors, business owners, people who saw me. I finally tapped the link. There it was. My face. On the front page of the Midwest Business Journal under the headline, "The Quiet Tech Mind Behind Northflow, the Millionaire." Nobody saw coming. $8 million. They printed the valuation, they printed my story, they printed everything. I felt the ground tilt beneath me. I didn't breathe for several seconds as the truth hit me. My family was going to see this. And once they did, nothing would ever be the same again. My phone started vibrating so violently on the nightstand that I thought it might fall off. At first, half asleep, I assumed it was an alarm I'd forgotten to turn off. But when I reached for it still groggy, I saw the truth, dozens of notifications lighting up the screen one after another. Missed calls, emails, LinkedIn messages, 3 voicemails, and a text from a number I didn't recognize that simply said, "Congratulations on the feature." My stomach dropped. I tapped the first link someone sent me. And there it was. My face, front and center. Top of the Midwest Business Journal homepage. The headline stretched across the screen in bold, "The Quiet Tech Mind Behind Northflow. The Millionaire Nobody Saw Coming." I felt the air leave my lungs. I read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less explosive. But the number was right there in black and white, $8 million. Not just hinted at, not just implied. Published. I barely had time to process it before another wave of emails came in. Clients congratulating me. Small investors expressing interest. A regional bank asking if I was open to acquisition conversations. PR agencies offering representation. People who'd never spoken to me suddenly wanted a piece of my time, my attention, my story. But my phone never buzzed with the names I expected. No mom, no dad, no Lila. The silence from home grew heavier with every passing minute. Evan sat up in bed rubbing his eyes. Morning. What's going? He stopped mid-sentence when he saw my face. What happened? I handed him the phone. He read the headline once and exhaled long and slow. Well, he murmured, there it is. But all I could think was, why haven't they called? By noon, hundreds of people had reached out. The article was being shared on business forums and local news sites. One small outlet even reprinted part of the story with the tagline, "Local underdog disrupts finance tech." But still nothing from my family. Around 1 o'clock, my phone finally pinged. A message from my mother. Honey, Dad and I are so proud of you. Can't wait to see you for Christmas dinner tonight. Love you. My heart lurched. Too sweet, too polished, too wrong. I called her instantly. She picked up on the second ring voice, unnaturally bright. Sweetheart, what a surprise, Mom, I said carefully. Did you see the article? Oh, that, she said breezily. Your father showed me. Wonderful picture of you. You look very professional. Is that all? Well, yes. What else is there to say? Just wanted to tell you we're proud. See you for dinner. Before I could respond, she hung up. I stared at the phone. Proud. She'd never once used that word for anything I'd done. Not for scholarships, not for awards, not for graduating early, not for working 3 jobs at once. But the minute money entered the picture, meaningful, irrefutable money she had pride to spare. Evan watched me quietly. She's nervous. About what? About what happens next? I wanted to argue, but I couldn't not when everything inside me knew he was right. A few minutes later, a message from Dad arrived. We always knew you were special. I almost laughed. They hadn't known anything. They'd never asked. The text felt less like love and more like scrambling, like they were trying to rewrite the past in real time. But one person still hadn't said a word. Lila. I checked her social media out of morbid curiosity. Nothing obvious, no mention of me, no cryptic quotes, no dramatic posts. But then I clicked on her story. Black background, white letters. A single line. Some people pretend to be small so they can feel powerful when they reveal who they really are. My hands went cold. Evan leaned over. That's about you. I know. My phone buzzed again, this time from an acquaintance who'd gone to school with Lila. She's been calling people all morning. She's freaking out. Whatever's happening, be careful tonight. A tense silence settled over me. This wasn't pride. This wasn't love. This was fear and envy and resentment that had finally found something solid to grab onto. By 5 o'clock, Evan and I were in the car heading toward my parents' house. Snow glowed blue under the headlights as we drove. I stared out the window, watching familiar streets flicker past, each one threaded with old memories. You don't have to go in unprepared, Evan said gently. I'll be fine. He reached over and squeezed my hand. I believe you. I'm just not sure they're ready. I didn't answer. When we pulled into the driveway, the house was lit up brighter than I'd ever seen it. Wreaths, garlands, candles in the windows, like they were staging the world's most aggressive Christmas card. My mother opened the door before we even reached the porch, smiling too wide. Hannah. Evan. Come in. Come in. She hugged me tight, too tight, like she was afraid I might dissolve if she let go. Dad shook Evan's hand, patting his shoulder too many times. "We're so glad you two are here. Really glad." The warmth was suffocating. Inside the table was set with the good china. The living room smelled like cinnamon and roasted turkey. And then I saw her Lila, sitting rigid on the couch, phone clutched in one hand, eyes fixed on me with a mix of shock, fury, and something darker. She didn't speak, didn't stand, didn't blink, just stared. Mom followed my gaze and fluttered nervously. "She's just had a long day. You know how emotional the holidays are." Evan murmured. "That's not emotion. That's a warning." Mom ushered us toward the dining room, speaking so quickly it was almost frantic. "Sit wherever you like, Hannah, sweetheart. We saved the center seat for you. The center seat. Lila's seat. Always had been." My pulse quickened. Dad poured wine like his hands were vibrating. "We're just so proud. So very proud." Every word sounded rehearsed, forced, frenzied, fearful. As we settled at the table, I tried to ignore the tension humming under the surface, the way Lila's fingers tapped against her glass. The strange glances passing between my parents like they were silently coordinating a strategy. We made small talk about the weather, about Evan's work, about Christmas lights downtown. Every topic was safe, controlled, neutral. But the whole time Lila was too silent, too still, like a storm waiting for the exact moment to split open the sky. Evan leaned in and whispered, "Your family's acting like they're hosting a peace summit." I know I whispered back. "They're scared. I know that too." Dinner had barely begun when Lila's fork scraped sharply against her plate. She finally looked up, her expression chilling. "So," she said, voice tight, "are we going to pretend nothing happened today?" Mom froze. Dad swallowed. My heart stopped. Evan whispered, "Here it comes." Lila lifted her phone off the table, turned it toward us, and tapped the screen. And there it was. The article. My face. The headline. The number. 8 million. I felt the room bend. "Since Hannah's not going to bring it up," Lila said, voice cracking at the edges, "I guess I will." Mom started shaking her head. "Lila, sweetheart, maybe?" "No." Lila snapped. "Not this time." Her eyes glittered like shattered ice. "Hannah, are you going to explain how you became a millionaire while the rest of us were bending over backward to support this family?" The room fell into a silence so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. And then slowly, deliberately, Lila stood up. Her chair scraped across the floor with a sound like tearing metal. She looked directly at me, chest rising and falling as if she'd run miles to reach this moment. "Let's talk about your $8 million, she said coldly. "Tonight." And I knew without a doubt that everything was about to break. Evan squeezed my hand as we walked up the icy front steps, but even his touch couldn't steady the thrum under my skin. The porch lights glowed too warmly, too bright, as if the house were trying to smile at us before we even opened the door. My mother flung it open with a breathless kind of cheer, the kind that always meant something was wrong. "There you are," she said, pulling me into a stiff hug that smelled like nutmeg and nerves. Inside the house was dressed up more extravagantly than I'd ever seen it for Christmas. Garlands draped over every doorway, candles flickered on the mantel. The dining room table sparkled with polished silverware and crystal glasses far nicer than anything we'd used before. It felt like they were staging a performance. Lila sat alone on the couch in the living room, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. She didn't stand. She didn't greet us. She just stared at her phone, her jaw tight enough to crack. Mom fluttered around us. "You must be cold. Come in, come in." "Evan, let me take your coat." "Hannah, you look so beautiful tonight." Evan shot me a look. "This is weird," he mouthed. I agreed. We stepped into the dining room, and that's when I saw it. The center seat, the seat that had always belonged to Lila, had been set for me. My name on a little handwritten card. Silverware placed perfectly, a small sprig of holly laid across the napkin. A coronation seat, or a trap. I hesitated. "Mom." Why honey sit tonight's special? You deserve the place of honor. She'd never said that in my entire life. Dad clapped Evan on the shoulder so hard it jolted him. Glad you're both here, he said, voice too loud. Let's have a wonderful night, all right, wonderful. Of course. We took our seats. Lila dragged herself to the table without a word and dropped into her chair as if gravity had doubled. She refused to look at me. She kept her phone propped against her glass, the glowing article headline visible every time she glanced down. Looks delicious, Evan said, trying to break the tension. Dad nodded violently. Your mother worked all day. She really wanted everything to be perfect. For Hannah. That was all it took for Lila's fingers to curl around her fork in a white-knuckled grip. We passed dishes around, making the kind of chirpy small talk people make when everyone is trying to pretend the house isn't full of invisible smoke. Traffic was light. Yes, very light. Cold night, huh? Oh, yes, cold. Beautiful decorations. Thank you. Hannah deserves something special. Each compliment aimed at me landed like a spark on dry leaves. Halfway through dinner, Lila still hadn't said a single word to me. She ate mechanically, eyes dark, shoulders tight. I couldn't tell if she was about to cry or explode. Mom, desperate to keep things calm, leaned toward her. Sweetheart, try the cranberry sauce. I put extra orange zest. Why are you pretending? Lila snapped. Mom froze. Dad stiffened fork halfway to his mouth. Evan set down his glass slowly. Lila turned toward me then finally, and the look she gave me made the hairs on my arms rise. You think I didn't see it, she said. The article. I swallowed hard. Lila. $8 million, she whispered, her voice quivering. 8 million. And here you are, sitting in the center like a queen. Mom tried to soothe her. Honey, please. But Lila kept going, her voice sharpening. All these years you let us think you were just Hannah. Simple Hannah. Practical Hannah. The one who didn't need anything. Her breathing quickened. You let me struggle. You let Mom and Dad worry. You let us think you were the steady one while you were building an empire behind our backs. Dad opened his mouth but no sound came out. Evan reached under the table and squeezed my knee. Don't panic. I didn't lie, I said quietly. I didn't hide it out of spite. Then what? Lila snapped. Too humble to mention you were becoming a millionaire, too modest to say you were one deal away from a fortune, or maybe you just enjoyed watching us live like idiots while you sat on money. The room went absolutely still. Even the Christmas lights seemed to stop blinking. That's not fair, Evan said sharply. Lila slammed her hand on the table so hard the silverware jumped. Stay out of this. You don't know what it's like growing up with her perfect grades and perfect behavior while I was the one expected to shine. Her breathing grew ragged, and now she's the one with the headline. She's the one with success. She's the one they're proud of. Her eyes glistened not with anger alone, but with something hollow and desperate underneath. Mom reached for her. Sweetheart, don't call me that. Lila jerked away. Not tonight. Not when everything was supposed to be mine. The words hung in the air like a blow. Dad tried again. Lila, honey, this isn't no, she snapped. Don't do that. Don't pretend we're a normal family having a normal Christmas dinner. Her chair screeched across the wood floor as she stood. She grabbed her glass of eggnog. Her eyes met mine. And I knew too late what she was about to do. $8 million, she hissed. While I got pity and scraps, she hurled the eggnog toward the wall. It hit with a sickening splatter, thick, creamy, dripping down the paint like melting snow. The shock of it rattled the air. Mom gasped. Dad knocked over his wineglass. Evan stood halfway, instinctively shielding me. But Lila didn't stop. You let me fail, she shouted. You let me drown. You let me believe I was the star while you were secretly outgrowing all of us. Her voice cracked so violently the words almost collapsed. You should have told us. You should have told me. Her hands shook visibly as she pressed them to her head. Do you understand what it feels like to realize your little sister did everything you were supposed to do? Everything I was raised to do. She slid down to her knees beside the table, sobbing now, her fury dissolving into anguish. I can't compete with this, she choked. I can't be you. I can't be better than you. I don't even know who I am next to you. Mom fell beside her, wrapping trembling arms around her shoulders. Dad sank into his chair like someone had kicked out his spine. Evan whispered, Jesus Christ. I didn't move. I couldn't. Not because I didn't care, but because I had spent my entire life learning not to take up space, not to be a burden, not to show too much. And now, suddenly, all the weight I'd carried in silence was pressing down on the room. Lila. I finally said, voice cracking. I wasn't trying to replace you. Her head lifted, makeup smeared, eyes wild. Then, what were you doing? She asked. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Because the truth, the real truth, was too old and too simple. I was just trying to exist, I whispered. She stared at me for a long moment, her chest rising and falling, her breath sharp between sobs. And then she got up, ran to the door, and fled into the cold night. The door slammed so hard the wreath fell sideways. Mom cried into her hands. Dad stared at the broken eggnog dripping down the wall. Evan rubbed my back with a shaking hand, and in the middle of all of it, I felt strangely empty. Like after 30 years of being overlooked, the storm I'd always known was coming had finally arrived. And there was no going back. I found my father in his study, standing next to his desk, as if he didn't quite know how to sit anymore. The lamp beside him cast a warm circle of light over scattered papers and old family photos, where Lila's face glowed from every frame, while mine hovered somewhere at the edge, as if I'd been added in later. He didn't look up when I stepped into the room. Instead, he muttered, I should have seen this coming, like he was talking to himself more than to me. I closed the door behind me softly. Dad. His shoulders sagged. Sit down, Hannah. I did slowly, the leather chair creaking underneath me. For a moment he didn't say anything. He rubbed his forehead with his thumb and forefinger the way he always did when tax season got overwhelming. But this wasn't numbers. This wasn't a miscalculation. This was decades of silence that had finally cracked open. Did you know, he began, voice low, that your sister used to come into this room and sit right where you're sitting? He pointed at my chair. She'd tell me every detail of her day, every meltdown, every victory, every friend who wronged her, every dream she had. I nodded faintly. You always listened. Yes, he said, eyes tired. And you never told me anything. Not really. I let out a slow breath. I didn't think you'd want to hear it. He winced. Why would you think that? Because every time I tried, I said carefully, you were already rushing to put out fires for her. There was never space left for me. He sank into his chair like someone had sliced his legs from under him. God, Hannah. I didn't know. I truly didn't know. I believed him. That was the worst part. He turned one of the picture frames toward himself, then toward me. A photo from Lila's 16th birthday. She stood center stage in a sequined dress, blowing out candles while our parents beamed. I was in the back, half obscured by someone's cousin. I look at these now, he said bitterly, and I see it. All the ways we made you invisible. I swallowed hard. Dad, that wasn't why I kept Northflow a secret. He looked up sharply. Then why I hesitated. Because I didn't want it to become a burden, or a weapon, or something used to fix every crisis. I wanted something in my life that was mine. He took a shaky breath. And we made you feel like you couldn't trust us with it. I didn't answer. He knew. Another long silence stretched between us. Finally, he asked, almost afraid, "What happens now?" "With your sister." I wanted to say I didn't know, that maybe she'd calm down, or maybe she'd never forgive me. But the truth settled in my chest like cold iron. "She's been spiraling for years," I said quietly. "Tonight just ripped the cover off." He nodded. "She's drowning, and she thinks I'm the reason." He nodded again, eyes clouded with the kind of guilt that ages a person 10 years in an hour. I softened my voice. "Dad, none of this is your fault alone." His lips trembled. "Maybe not alone, but I enabled it. And I didn't protect you." His voice cracked. "A father is supposed to protect his children. Both of them." Something inside me loosened a knot I'd held for years. "I know you tried," I whispered. He bowed his head. It wasn't enough. I wasn't ready to answer that. Before either of us could speak again, we heard my mother's muffled sobs from upstairs. Dad glanced toward the door. She's taking this harder than she's letting on. I believed that too. "Go," he said softly. "She needs you." But before I left, he reached across the desk and took my hand. His grip was firm, trembling slightly. "Hannah, I'm proud of you. Truly. Not for the money, for the grit, for the work, for the woman you've become." His voice steadied. "And I'm sorry I didn't see you sooner." My chest tightened with old hurt and new understanding.